I'm George Cheedy. We're on location downtown at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is the next Atlanta. Consider two truths at once. Atlanta presents itself as a black mecca for upwardly mobile African Americans to come and prosper. But born poor here, people have the worst chance in America of rising into the top 20% of incomes. Corporate Atlanta says it wants to lower barriers. Let's look at those barriers and what it'll take to knock them down. We have to talk about it on the next Atlanta. I'm George Cheedy. We're at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is the next Atlanta, and I'm with John Lawson, a business coach and entrepreneur here in Atlanta. We're going to talk about what it means to be a person in business in Atlanta and the African American experience there. Like, John, I'm glad you're here. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for the invite. This is awesome.
So, all right, tell me about your tale. Like, what brought you to Atlanta, like everybody else who comes to Atlanta?
I was doing some stuff, entrepreneurial in my hometown, which is, well, not totally hometown, but where I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. We used to call it Slow Lumbus, right? Because it was just slower than the rest of even Ohio, because people talk about Cleveland, they talk about Cincinnati. You never talk about Columbus at that time, and this is, 25 years ago. Well, when I'm talking about this, making this move. And something about Atlanta was very attractive. It attracted my sister to come here. I came down to visit her for a weekend, and I literally ended up moving because there was an old saying, big fields await the wide awake man. And when I came to Atlanta, I had never seen a Black experience like I had seen when I came to Atlanta, meaning that when I went to the white tablecloth restaurant, it wasn't only white people, or the only Black people weren't serving the white people. Not saying that in a bad way, it is what it was. But you come here and every place we went, Black people, cars that I've never seen driven, by even white people in Ohio, they were being driven by Black people here in Atlanta. And that saying resonated with me. I said, I'm playing too small, and I can only grow as a fish as big as the tank you put me in.
So what was the first job you got when you came here?
The first job I got when I came here was working with IBM, and I have an IT background. I was always into computers and stuff, went to DeVry Institute, and so I had a marketable, skill, and I literally put my resume online and got the job.
It's a different environment for African American business, frankly, like in Atlanta, than in a lot of places. What have you seen as an entrepreneur here? How difficult is it to open or close doors? What's different?
Well, I've only done it here in terms of built my thing here.
Yeah.
So I can't really say completely what's different, but I will tell you that the environment here allowed me to explore what other people were doing, get to access resources that I might not have been able, that are way more mature for African Americans here a little bit than they might have been where I was. And again, this is early 2000s, and so I think that was a big thing. And I don't think, we're here in this great museum, and I don't think people understand how low level understanding we have to being entrepreneurs as African Americans, Black people, right? Because in the old days, that's all you had. If you wanted to get to a salon, you had to go to a Black salon. You want to stay in a hotel, it was a Black hotel. You want to know which hotel, you had the green book to tell you. You see what I'm saying? So everything that was required of entrepreneurial was done in the Black community, just like in the white community. And it wasn't until, segregation was lifted that all of a sudden we had this, I can go and shop downtown and with any, And the cool thing was when I was getting started, that resonated with me a lot. And I realized that my ice was just as cold as the white man's ice. And that alone allowed me to branch out.
So you're a business coach.
Yes.
Are many of your clients African-American?
All right now. Well, I'm not gonna say all, but the majority of them are, yes.
So what advice do you give them? We're talking about people who are trying to get something going here in Atlanta. Like, what advice do you give them that makes sense here?
When I was growing up, we always were trying to be as broad as possible. I didn't want to get, nailed down to just a Black business for Black people.
Right.
And what I'm seeing today is this next generation understands that there's riches and niches. We always used to say that, and we understood that, but I don't think we ever recognized that Black businesses for Black people is a niche, and there is a lot of growth here in that niche. And I see that right now happening. It's pretty cool.
Atlanta is so much about networking, I've discovered. The Atlanta business community is fairly tight-knit, and a lot of what I see seems to be around who you know and like who you're doing business with. How do you advise somebody to break into like the Atlanta scene as an entrepreneur?
If for Atlanta, you gotta go out, right? There's so many mixers and meetups. Of course, we're in COVID right now, but that's gonna lift. But also, it kind of makes it really cool because you don't have to leave your house now to do the networking. So you can find a lot of meetups and networking events online, and you just get in there and you start talking to people. And my biggest thing is nobody's really interested in what you do. You need to be interested in what they do. And that will get you in the door. Hey, what do you do? How do you do that? You know what I'm saying? Things like that, asking those kind of questions, people will teach you. They will teach you everything they know if you act dumb.
So what can corporate Atlanta do better in terms of nurturing African-American talent?
They need to really seek it out, welcome it, and understand that we all come from different backgrounds. So if you want to bring in and help grow these inner city people, these inner city youth that are amazing, just recognize that they have a different culture and learn that culture and allow that to become part of the fabric of your company. It'll make it a better company.
So Atlanta, the Black Mecca, the place that people across the country see as, heaven for Black entrepreneurship, Black business, Black people in business. When you came here, was that everything that you had thought it was going to be?
Yeah and no. I mean, Atlanta from the outside looks like the Black Mecca, but what we don't recognize, or what I will say right now, is there's levels to everything. All right. So Atlanta is a Black Mecca for colleges, right? And HBCUs have their own little clique that goes on in the business community here. And because I wasn't part of that, I ain't got nothing branded on my arm. I can't sing the songs and I don't do the dance. You feel me? So it was a whole nother level of being exclusionary that I had to learn. So it's just not about, just because you're a person of color, you're gonna all of a sudden just be welcome. There's still other, levels that you have to deal with, even in our own community.
John, I'm deeply grateful that you've been here with us today.
Well, I appreciate that, and you're not reading that off a card either. No. So.
I'm not. This is The Next Atlanta. I'm George Cheedy. I am here with Andrea Dittman, who's a professor and researcher of organizational behavior and management at Emory's Gozueta Business School. Andrea, I'm incredibly grateful for your time here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I think this is a really exciting program and you're covering some really important issues, so it's really great to be a part of it.
So first, tell us a little bit about your work and research.
Yeah, definitely. So I would consider myself a diversity and inequality researcher primarily, but within that sort of broad umbrella of a topic, I primarily focus on social class. And so the way in which employees' social class backgrounds continue to sort of affect their ability to perform up to their full potential in the workplace.
And incredibly relevant work right now, I would say.
I think so, yeah.
One of the things we're looking at here is corporate diversity in Atlanta, and the question of whether or not Atlanta is living up to the promise that that's been made to the African American community here. There's this picture of this city as the Black Mecca, people moving here from everywhere, hoping to climb the ladder one way or another. But you don't see proportionately as many people of color in positions of managerial authority in the companies around here. Why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a great question and something that a lot of researchers are constantly working on and have been working on for a long time. I think that there's a lot of different reasons that could be the case. The reasons that I can speak to the most have to do with sort of the differences in what is sort of valued or seen as the right way to pursue power and what would actually feel normal or natural or easy for underrepresented folks. So folks who are people of color, women, people from working class backgrounds, kind of what would feel natural to them and the way that they would want to pursue power is not really the way that it's normative in modern organizations today. So I think that that certainly is a piece of the puzzle and a piece that I'm the most focused on in my own research.
Understood. How much straight up racism do you anticipate people face when they're looking at the business community here?
You know, I think people are sort of unwilling to admit that. It's a very sensitive topic, but I think you can sort of look at it indirectly in certain ways. And what we know is that there is a lot of discrimination in hiring. And it's, again, probably most likely at an implicit level. But we do see that a lot of, especially elite employers, are hiring for something that the sociologist Lauren Rivera has called cultural fit. And it sounds very nice and neutral that you would want to just hire someone that will fit with the culture of the organization. But what we see, and when they do these resume audit studies, is that actually disproportionately disadvantages people of color, women, and people from lower social class backgrounds as well.
Got it. So there's a legitimate place for culture fit when you're looking at organizations. Some cultures have to have a very competitive environment because they're competing very strongly with other people. Sometimes there's a collaborative element, but culture, we think of culture when we're looking at this, when people who aren't business guys, like you and I, people who have studied this, like they look at culture and they go, oh, you mean like, where do you go to church? What kind of, food do you like? That sort of thing. It's not the same thing we're talking about there, is it?
Right, exactly. And so there, of course, is a lot of research in organizational behavior on the importance of sort of value fit. So kind of having similar values as an employee that are valued in the organization. And that's a very neutral and potentially even beneficial thing. We see that those employees have higher job satisfaction and are, usually performing better. And so that's a completely sort of separate issue. The cultural fit that we're talking about is really, do you participate in the same sort of elite sports that I do? Do you have similar music tastes? What organizations have you participated, extracurriculars and things like that. And that's a very different thing. And you would think should be relatively orthogonal to whether you'd be a good fit at the organization, but nonetheless is really important to a lot of hiring managers.
That's what I keep hearing. People keep telling me about golf. Like, oh, well, I don't golf. And so I couldn't climb the corporate ladder because I didn't have enough in common to talk about people with, in the break room or something like that. So how do companies get past this? Assuming a company is sincere about wanting to diversify its employee base and its leadership, how does a company look at these things and then make changes?
Agreed. I think that is the question, the $1 million question right there. I think what they need to do is really think more carefully and more broadly about diversity. So I think it's oftentimes we think a lot about race and gender, and those are very visible forms of diversity. But again, what my work is really showing is that social class background is relatively less visible, but is also a super important feature that actually shapes whether people can sort of access and rise through the ranks in these organizations. So I think kind of making a more inclusive definition of diversity is a great first step. And then I think what we need to also do is kind of create more inclusive evaluations and inclusive ways of sort of assessing employees and potential hires and applicants as well, so that we're kind of recognizing diverse talents and competencies instead of sort of assuming that this kind of normative way that we think of like individual achievers is the right and best way to sort of hire and promote.
Do you have metrics? Like, what are the numbers that, when you're looking at these issues, what are the numbers that pop up in your own head
about these issues?
Yeah.
Yes. The numbers that I think a lot about are this social class pay gap that we've actually seen emerge. There's been some really fascinating work in sociology about this. And they have shown that even after kind of controlling for all these things that we know are related to your salary, like the eliteness of your institution and like where you're working and all these things, we actually see that there's about a 17% pay gap. So people from middle or upper class backgrounds are earning 17% more than their equally credentialed counterparts from working class backgrounds. So I think that number always really stands out to me because they basically tried to, eliminate that gap as much as they could with other variables, and it still persisted. It was extremely persistent. So I think that one, and I'm sure it's sort of a similar story for other groups that are underrepresented as well.
I would assume that's just the measure of how much personal connections and personal background matter.
Yes, absolutely. And I've done interviews with MBA students from different social class backgrounds, and the network element came up so often. When you talk about that golf story, that could be a direct quote from one of my interviews. They talked about how they had never even heard of snowboarding growing up. And of course, their family didn't have enough resources to sort of get them into snowboarding. So, they asked kind of their colleague, what is snowboarding? And the colleague was so taken aback that a person could not even know what snowboarding is. And then, of course, that interviewee described how they sort of withdrew and didn't really want to ask questions anymore because they didn't want people to know what they didn't know.
Can you tell me about Gozueta's new Business and Society Institute?
Yes, I also think it's a really great timing to be talking with you here because we just last month launched our new Business and Society Institute. So this institute is really, the overall goal is reimagining organizations as catalysts for social change. And there's two pillars within that. One pillar is about climate change, but the other pillar is extremely relevant to our conversation today because it's about how organizations can combat inequality. So I think it's very much in keeping with one of the goals and missions of Gozueta going forward is kind of addressing these issues. And they do have a major focus on sort of local Atlanta issues and inequalities in Atlanta.
Does the business community, and I'm including Emory in this, have a particular responsibility to reduce inequality here right now?
I would argue that they do. I think that may be a somewhat radical stance to many organizational stakeholders, but I think the inequality is rising to levels that we haven't seen since the Roaring 20s. And I think that organizations are a major contributor to that. But on the flip side, they have a lot of power and they have a lot of ability to sort of right these wrongs and address these issues kind of outside of waiting for governmental intervention or things like that. So I think it is a moral responsibility. And I also think that there is potential to sort of have more diverse and more effective workforces if you are actually combating inequality. And I think it could actually be beneficial for their bottom line as well.
Professor Dittman, I'm incredibly grateful for the time that you've been able to give us right now. This has been insightful. You are somebody we really needed to hear from.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great having this conversation.
I'm George Chidi. This is The Next Atlanta, and I'm on a Zoom conference call with Charles Steele Jr., President and CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I'm incredibly grateful to have you join us. I'm so glad that we're talking. You've focused to some degree on equity issues in corporate America. This is something you've worked on for a long time. Broadly, where do you see failures within corporate America in terms of racial equality?
Well, in corporate America, I'll start there. First of all, with a particular company I just got involved with to bring about a resolution to a racial discrimination case that was filed, is the fact that the CEO himself of this company was also the diversity chair. Now, how in the world can you be the CEO, president as well, and also be the chairman of the diversity board within your corporation? Impossible. You bring people from the outside who understand equitability or lack of equitability within the working force that's diverse within your company.
It's interesting that you bring up this need for there to be external validation. Essentially, people outside of an organization with eyes on what an organization is doing in order to ensure that it's getting to equity. That's the thing I want to ask you about. Because Atlanta, like the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, has an initiative where they're asking their members to engage in acts of diversity and inclusion, basically to help more people of color in Atlanta's corporations. What would you want to see in order to say, yes, this is a credible effort? What does credibility look like to you?
You're talking about credibility, you're talking about integrity, you're talking about track record, you're talking about loyalty. It's a package, but a lot of entities that makes the circle. We're going full circle with this situation. What you must realize is that people must be trained on an ongoing basis.
So this initiative, one of the things they're talking about is trying to have metrics, a measurable result. You could start by saying, okay, there are 35% of the community is Black. You'd expect 35% of your executives to be Black. That would be a metric. The question is whether or not they'll be clear enough about trying to get to a number, or whether they'll be afraid of setting a quota. You know what happens as soon as the Q word pops up? There's all this pushback. How do we get past that so we can actually get to a result that's going to be effective?
Well, first of all, you can't use the metrics and the quota and the data like that. I mean, sure, they have a place, but not in this particular venue. It doesn't have a place. For an example, when President Barack Obama was elected president the first time, not to mention the second time, the perception of the people in this country in leadership roles, corporate as well as politicians, use that to say that racism is over. Racism is over. We need no metrics. We need no quotas anymore. It's all over. And they would call me because I'm in the position of Dr. King. And the first thing I said, it's not over. It's embedded within our system, racism. And people refuse to talk about it. That's what you have to accomplish, first of all, to start with conversation on a realization that we have a problem.
How significant do you believe racism is within the corporate community in Atlanta? I'm really specific about Atlanta here because there's this vision of Atlanta as a Black Mecca. You come here from wherever, you're gonna make it as long as you do all the right things. I'm not 100% sure that's true. And I think some of that has to do with the way corporate Atlanta works. I don't want to attack it, but I'm curious about what your perceptions are.
I don't want to limit it to Atlanta, but I will on this particular response. I always heard when you get outside Atlanta, you're in Georgia. You understand? So how can you separate Atlanta from Georgia? So my whole point is I asked the question, how many Black folks or people of color own the skyscrapers downtown Atlanta? And I stopped right there. That's wealth. How much Black wealth do we have in Atlanta? Atlanta cannot be excluded from the rest of the world in the Black and brown community. We lost 60% of Black wealth, which are our homes. So you can't separate Atlanta from who's in office in DC or who's controlling the wealth in the rest of America because of the impact it has on Atlanta. You can't do that. Atlanta is a part of the problem that's universal and particularly of this nation. This nation was founded upon racism. And Atlanta has the mecca of responsibility of proving itself that we will be the city and the gateway of opportunity for Black and brown people without using measurement, just doing what's right. And the first thing, Dr. King says, always right to do right. But the first thing Atlanta got to do is to be trained.
The thing I want to get at is how to fix it. Concrete steps that folks like you are taking to get at it, to get at the dirt under the rug that people don't want to talk about. The things that I can tell other people to do so that when they see it, they can stop it, at least to the degree that they can. What have you seen that works, that stops this cold?
Well, first of all, what you just said, the 6 steps. Okay. And I keep saying that, and people act like I'm not telling them that. You got to be trained in the Kenyan philosophy. It's a 6-step principle. Number 1, gather information. What is that? Facts. I got a research team out of DC, 3 or 4, 5, 6 people as economists and as experts in race relations. So when I need something, I want something, and even if I don't, something they think I need, they send it to me. So you can talk loud at me, but you can't debate me if I got the facts. That's number 1. Number 2, I never lost a case with the Kenyan philosophy on the 6 steps. Never. Now watch me. Number 2, after you get the facts, then you educate the public on the facts. Number 3, you make a personal commitment. You know, people will kill you, for things like this because you bringing the truth to light. I mean, personal commitment. Let nothing get in my, even death can't stop me. Okay. Number 4, you got to know how to negotiate. I've been doing that for many of years. Not only am I a former state senator, I've been involved with SCLC for many, many, many years, 45, 46 years. So this is the one that get me. I'm almost there. Number 5, direct action. You don't use that as number 1. I'm gonna build it up so high, you can't get out of this, but you don't do it as number 1. Number 6, you always reconcile. Reconciliation.
Mr. Steele, I'm incredibly grateful. This is exactly what we needed. Thank you for your time today. Atlanta is complicated when it comes to race and business. There are levels of success. One thing that's become clear is that corporate Atlanta has more to do in order to create equity in this society. We've given you a lot to think about and some resources to use. I invite you to watch this episode again and each of the previous thought-provoking episodes of The Next Atlanta. Just log on to fox5atlanta.com, go to the shows section at the bottom of the page and click on The Next Atlanta. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon for the next episode of The Next Atlanta.